can sound from the attack of the pollen out there. It is it's like a bombardment. But it's good to have you inside with us and to talk about geopolitics, climate, and trade, all small issues, all in 50 minutes. So it's going to be a good time. Luckily, I have 1/50th of the Senate with us here on stage, along with Dr. Bliss, which is going to be for a great conversation. But first, actually, if I may, while he's sipping real quick on his cold brew, I want to start with you, Senator Cassidy, and I want to start with climate, because the issue that when it comes to climate, when it comes to Republicans, and seems to be the bipartisan effort here, is that climate is a national security issue. There is an intersection between the two, and that there is progress being made on treating climate as a national security issue. And so I'm wondering if you can just start us off a little bit on sort of where that intersection is and how you're thinking about it.
Yeah, first I thank the Institute for having me. To give a talk like this forces you to condense your thoughts and to distill them to a point where you can communicate them to others, which in turn means that you understand them a little bit better yourself. I'll start this year, as I did last year, quoting Dr. Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, in which he describes the tight statistical relationship between a country growing economically, thereby using more energy, and as they grow economically, better funding their military. This is China. In the early 2000s, they were behind many other countries in manufacturing, GDP, energy use, and military strength. But in the interim, they have grown to where they are #1 in manufacturing, second largest economy in terms of GDP. They use far more energy than any other country, and they now are second only to the United States in terms of military strength. Now, the interesting thing is, if you will, as part of their economic strategy, they use cheap coal for the majority of their feedstock. That cheap coal has, and they don't enforce their environmental standards. So combine the two, and they are now far and away #1 in emissions. Now, this is more than an association, it is causation. Their decision to use cheap coal and to not enforce environmental standards lowers the cost of manufacturing in China. So companies that might have been in South Louisiana will relocate or at least expand operations in China because that is a cheaper point of production. And it's cheaper precisely because they use cheap coal and they don't enforce environmental standards. So the question is, how do we address this? Now, I'm looking at my notes. Their strategy is cheap energy, high pollution. The U.S. challenge, if you will, is how do we protect our economy? How do we protect our economy? And if you will, addressing the fact that energy is associated with emissions in a way which decreases military tension. And when I say protect our economy, I mean not just the meta economy, but also that of the workers, the people who depend upon our policies to create opportunity for they and their family. I have been advocating a carbon border adjustment mechanism, or what I prefer to call a foreign pollution fee. What a foreign pollution fee does, it says, okay, China, you are lowering your cost of production by not enforcing environmental standards and the energy source that you choose. Therefore, you are exporting the cost of that production upon the rest of the world. What we're going to do is calculate that cost, that difference between us managing our environmental standards and they not, and we're going to measure that cost and we're going to apply it to those goods which you send to the United States, energy-intensive goods. So as we apply that, we will level the playing field. Now, this is most effective if we do it as part of a climate club in which the United States, EU, UK, Japan, you name it, those like-minded countries, together we have a climate club, and together any country which refuses to enforce environmental standards pays that fee. Among ourselves, we import-export without that fee because we are of like mind with similar standards and similar emission profiles. This plays to the U.S. advantage. Our goods in steel, aluminum, chemicals are 80 to 260% lower in terms of emissions than those identical Chinese products. And in this way, with this climate club, I think we have the ability to protect our economy, rebuilding opportunity for our working and middle class, And with our energy policy and with this trade policy, encouraging countries worldwide to adopt our environmental standards as opposed to copy China's ignoring of environmental standards. And as we relatively weaken China's economy, we make it less likely that they can fund that military adventure, which in turn decreases the risk for military conflict worldwide. To quote Clausewitz, or at least to paraphrase him, a climate border adjustment mechanism or a foreign pollution fee is politics by other means.
So if I may very quickly, I know this is an imperfect comparison, but it almost sounds like you're advocating for a climate NATO.
A what?
A climate NATO.
Well, that's an interesting concept. But it isn't against a common enemy, because we don't want to have military conflict with China. And China can escape this foreign pollution fee by beginning to lower their pollution. What it really is, if you will, is a club which you want people to want to belong. And if they belong, they escape the effects of the fee, and so therefore they are more likely to economically grow. I would argue it is addressing a market distortion of China exploiting the desire for the West and Western value countries to lower their emission profile. They're exploiting that for their economic advantage and stealing jobs along with it. I think this corrects a market distortion.
Well, it's interesting. According to my notes, a White House agrees with your foreign emissions fee.
This White House.
This White House, exactly. You pulled off the joke way far better than I did. Senator Cassidy's working on, obviously on this issue. This is something you've been working on for quite some time, and you've talked about it in your 287 Senate speeches on climate, not in all of them, and so I can't wait to hit 300. But I am interested in where there are points of agreement on this issue, and are there ways to work together, or are you seeing it, even if there are slight differences, are there in the way you're seeing it?
No, I think there's a lot of agreement. There was nothing that Bill just said that I would challenge. I think we are looking at some very obvious facts, which is that if you want to influence China's pollution levels and solve climate change as a global problem, you've got to make it expensive for them to keep polluting the way they are. And that's very powerful. If you want to protect US industries, you have to make sure that we're not at an economic disadvantage because of our better emissions outcomes. Mm-hmm. There we agree. And the agreement isn't just two guys sitting on, stuffed chairs here in Arizona. There's actually an apparatus working with us, very thoughtful analytics groups like Silverado and Resources for the Future, very thoughtful corporate groups like the Corporate Climate Leadership Council. And so we're like two little tips here of an iceberg that is moving to make this work and make this happen, and also to convince the Biden administration that it's a really good idea.
And hasn't melted yet. The
And
iceberg.
what?
The iceberg hasn't melted yet.
No.
Yeah.
Dr. Bliss, say hypothetically you had the ear of two senators right now about
Hypothetically.
because you study this issue very closely, and actually I do want to read something that you said in a 2016 interview. And you said, "We have a tendency to ignore complexity, but our society has gotten to a point where we can't ignore it anymore. Our government is well positioned to start addressing wicked problems, but it's not there yet. Removing stovepipes has to be taken to a whole new level." So again, you have the ear of two senators here. How do they take it to a whole new level? Of course, they're trying to address this carbon issue, but this is far larger than just that.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I just want to say a huge thank you to the McCain Institute for having me here. This is such an honor and pleasure and an incredibly intimidating chair and group of people to be with. I'm a slightly less useful type of doctor than Senator Cassidy. I can help you with matrix algebra, but if you are feeling lightheaded, please don't come to me.
If you need a colonoscopy, talk me out.
So this is my first time here, but I actually was almost here in 2020 to talk about AI. So we know how that went. I appreciate that this forum has always been incredibly forward-looking. So now everybody's talking about AI, and that was a topic of conversation 3 years ago. So A couple of things. So there's an interesting set of notes in the National Security Strategy that kind of connects, makes these connections between space and cyber as a space where the norms don't exist and we don't quite know how to operate. So I think climate has a similar aspect to it. So you talked about this notion of a climate NATO. I don't know if it makes sense to have like a climate command, but climate is one of those borderless, sometimes actorless threats. And it requires fundamentally a set of incentives that would create such conditions that would allow people to actually take advantage of the emergence of really significant technological advances. So I do think looking at incentive structures is very important. I also think it has to be sort of collaboration, and partnerships. And those collaboration and partnerships have to be between disciplines. For example, you have to implement resilience in communities if you're going to have adoption of innovative technologies. So if those partnerships don't exist, we won't be able to make progress. And I do think it's that, how do we incentivize the combination of innovation and resilience together in context of whether it's economic policy or some other kind of policy? That's what I would love to see.
Did I see a shaking head during those comments? Or
Yeah, so no, I'm totally enjoying what my colleagues are saying. And by the way, I enjoyed the previous panels. When Seth and Stephanie were speaking about trade and our ongoing trade deficit and how previous measures have not worked, previous measures have depended upon China fulfilling their end of a bargain. But as was mentioned last night by the Admiral, win-win might mean for China, China wins and China wins. What I like about this is it's almost a trustless environment. We know the emission profile of much of what they do. I spoke to the CEO of one of our super major oil and gas companies. He said there's only 2 or 3 configurations of a refinery. You show me a configuration, I know what your emission profile is. So we want to move to a trustless, if you will, a system of, okay, you've got to comply with this. And so in a trustless system, we know what the emission profile is going to be, well, with roughly of their steel. Therefore, we're going to apply the CBAM on that differential between what we've done and theirs. One example, I think on steel, if you just go with me on units, the emission profile of a ton of steel in the United States would be 1. In the EU, it's 1. In Mexico, it's 1.2. And in China, it would be 2.4. And in Russia, it would be 2.6. You can create a foreign pollution fee, CBAM, based upon that information, which is then applied to those products. That is trustless. We don't have to rely upon them buying more soybeans, as Congresswoman Murphy pointed out, they're not doing. This is like, here comes the steel, boom, you're going to stick it on there. And that taxes the externality that they're not internalizing, they're foisting upon us. That corrects that market distortion.
But we're basically already moving into a trustless phase here when it comes to climate change and trade. I mean, you've got National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan giving a speech at Brookings in which he says America's basically an industrial policy power now. We've got the IRA in the US, we've got that haymaker, we've got the uppercut of CBAM from Europe, we've got China, what they've been doing. And so I'm wondering, maybe Senator Whitehouse, you can jump in on this, it feels like every country is sort of figuring out how to incentivize their best carbon emissions problems, but it's leading to, and maybe necessarily, but it is leading to this trustless environment that is also causing frictions among allies.
Well, I think we need to bring it all on. And I think the frictions can work themselves out quite readily. The last thing we want to do is let the frictions deter us from solving the underlying problem. Frictions are actually a pretty quality problem to have compared to failure. So I actually sort of like what we went through with the IRA and Europe, where we did the IRA, we put a lot of money into supporting the transition to clean energy. They went nuts because they thought this was going to steal jobs out of Europe and move work and manufacturing to the United States. We told them, tough bounce, too bad. If you don't like it, meet us or beat us, do something better, but don't complain. And now we're in a situation where the EU has already approved its CBAM, its Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. That will be tariffing US business exports to Europe. We don't like that. I'm sure there's going to be some kvetching from the Biden administration about that. And now the EU folks are in a perfect position to say back to us, hey, tough bounce, too bad. This is the new standard, meet it or beat it. And I think if we end up doing both, if we end up with a much more robust industrial policy supporting the transition, and we have a matching carbon tariff, carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, then we're suddenly beginning to open a pathway to climate safety, which we do not presently have. So I think it's a win-win to pursue both, and we just have to kind of power through the complaining and get to a place where we're all on the same page. The EU and us can get together. The UK already has done the hard part. They've already got a carbon price. Going from a carbon price to a carbon tariff is a very easy step. Their legislative committee has already said, let's do it. Their government has already said, we like your recommendation to the parliamentary committee. And the Canadians, I'm sure, will follow us as soon as we move. So Bill's idea of there being a common carbon tariff platform among all these major economies is actually quite close to hand as long as we don't screw it up.
So can you just quickly unpack this just a little bit more? Because the underlying tension under all of this has been, everyone keeps talking about you need cooperation with allies in order to, and like-minded entities in order to solve the climate crisis. But, as you just said, there's the competition. You basically had to go tell the Europeans to pound sand. I was in Europe as Europeans were yelling into Joe Manchin's face. So I'm wondering how you can sort of, how can you get both?
Well, it's made easier by the fact that with respect to the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment that the EU has adopted, there's a big sweetener here. So if we have to take a little medicine in the form of the tariff, if we do nothing, the sweetener is that because the tariff on China is so much greater, so much more robust, the folks at Bruegel, which is the analytics shop advising the EU CBAM effort, calculate that America's a net winner because whatever we lose through the tariff, we way more than gain through manufacturing supply chain moving to the United States from China. So that's a pretty good sweetener, and that assumes we sit on our rear ends and do nothing. If we can actually get a carbon border adjustment of our own so we don't have the tariff penalty and we're only enjoying the benefit, then it's 2 thumbs up. So this is actually, if we do it right, a pretty significant win-win-win situation for international agreement, for trade, and for climate safety.
A rebuttal from the senator.
No rebuttal.
I'm joking.
No rebuttal. But let me just put it on the flip side. Sheldon spoke of the win-win. There's also the consequence of failure to collaborate. Sheldon and I were in a meeting, a bipartisan meeting of probably about 6 or 8 of our senators, representing a philosophical, spectrum. And
we were definitely on the spectrum.
Proudly. And at some point, as we're talking back and forth about the Climate Club, I'm sitting there thinking, hey guys, what happens if the EU puts in a CBAM and we don't? China will begin dumping all of the goods that formerly went to the EU into the United States. And we all looked at each other across that political spectrum and we said, that's true. The price of failure is that there would be state-owned enterprises subsidizing goods, looking for a market, and we would be the largest because now they're boxed out of the EU. So there's also a price for failure. There's a win-win, and there's, oh my gosh, we better not go there. So whatever differences, friction there might be, I think that the win-win and the price of failure should coalesce us to overcome those difficulties.
Dr. Bliss, you study the complexity of all these issues. Is there an ability to have this win-win that the senators are talking about?
Well, how can I argue? I mean, we have an agreement across the aisle.
I'm doing a terrible moderating job. I can't get you guys to disagree on anything.
So let's see, how will I coach this? I really like putting this in context of incentives. I also think the bringing in allies and geopolitics into the conversation is incredibly important. I think there is a pretty significant national security risk here as well. And
a national security risk of doing it or of not doing it?
Of not doing it.
Okay.
Yes, of not mitigating climate change. I think there's a lot of vulnerable communities that potentially, a country like China can go into and establish a lot more favorable atmosphere for authoritarian regimes. I mean, essentially what we're talking about is competition and discussion between different values, autocracies and democracies. So I think there's a lot of positive things here. What worries me, for example, is the National Intelligence Estimate identified essentially climate disinformation or countries misreporting on their emissions as a significant threat to national security. And particularly China is very good at manipulating the information environment. So mitigating those type of threats in context of these incentives is something that would have to be considered. But I don't think we can solve everything with one piece of legislation, so I imagine that's not how the Senate works.
You're right, but
Yeah.
it's also a very achievable thing
Yes.
to do.
Agreed.
And there'll be huge motivation to get it right.
Yeah.
And a lot of data out there exists already.
Yeah.
So if we passed one, we wouldn't have to go out and build the differential analysis. It's there to be applied, and you just continue to move the dials. And in fact, you expect to move the dials because countries that are on the losing end of the tariff are going to want to get out from under that tariff, so they're going to want to improve their performance, so they're going to shift off high emissions energy to low emissions energy, and as they do that, they're going to want credit. So it has to be a real-time moving, shift the dials incentive
Yeah.
program, and I
There's
think that's
potential-
really going to be effective.
I'm sorry, if I can. There's potential there also to sort of increase or reduce China's control of critical minerals, for example, with something like this, with a legislation like this. You know, right now, if you think about electric vehicles, they rely on cobalt. 15 out of 19 mines, I think, in Democratic Republic of Congo are controlled by China. If you can trace some of that to, how China operates, you have potential for other countries to be able to engage in that critical mineral space as well.
You got a two-finger, Senator? Or do you...
Yeah, I just want to say that I loved what the military people said. They wake up every day and think, how do we avoid war with China? And the nice thing about this policy, I'm going to echo what Sheldon and Dr. Bliss said, it has a way to diffuse that tension. This is not a tariff of which a Chinese company cannot get out from underneath. Yes, of course, you start off with country averages because we know the country average of China, and we want to make sure that we don't have that tension of them misrepresenting their results. But if they are able to show a company, perhaps a subsidiary of a US or Japanese company, which we know has good environmental standards, or if they can bring a company with a cutting-edge new technology which lowers emission profiles, then perhaps they could get out from underneath this tariff and for that particular subset from that particular plant. Now, there's some nuances here. You don't want the stuff that's good coming to us and the stuff that's bad going elsewhere in the world. But we got to give a mechanism by which China and another country which may not be similarly situated, which is similarly situated, can escape from the tariff. And so we want to work constructively. And again, I think all of us should think what those generals do and admirals do when they wake up. How do we avoid war? I do think that a CBAM is a lot cheaper than war. And I do think it is, again, to paraphrase Clausewitz, a foreign policy or politics by other means.
So peace through tariff strength.
Yes, kind of.
Okay.
But through a climate club in which we are united. By the way, we would have a minority of the population if you had the EU, US, Japan, et cetera. You would have a majority of the value-add purchasing in the world. The economic power of that bloc to shape a country like Vietnam's environmental policy would be tremendous because they want to import to us, but they would have to meet our environmental standards. as opposed to debasing their environment and trying to outcompete China by lowering their cost of production.
And if you want to fuel innovation, you fuel innovation by providing serious financial incentives and rewards when that innovation succeeds. And at the moment, we have way too little of it because it's too often free to pollute. Put a price on that, and suddenly the market has the incentive to respond. So this creates that incentive reward system, not only in our country, but it propagates it throughout the world. And it's the single most, I think, impactful thing that we can do. And when people present the argument, oh, we have to throw up our hands, forget doing anything on climate, because no matter how good a job we do in America, China and India are still going to pollute, so let's do nothing. Here's the solution to that. And don't underestimate the amount of economic pressure this will put China under. This is no small thing. So we're going to have to work to moderate the diplomatic consequences of that pressure. It is real.
So excuse this kind of high-level question, but from a couple of years ago, all I would hear in discussions like this was, well, the market will solve this, right? The market provides the incentives. If people want green technology, they're going to go and buy green technology. If they
And what's rule one of the market? Rule one of the market is that the negative externalities of a product should be in the price of the product. Yes. Rule one. And we violate that rule spectacularly with respect to fossil fuel. IMF has that at $660 billion in effective incentive just in the US every single year. 660 billion is a very big number. And you start to have the market adjust for that, and then the market works. We're trying to get to a market that works.
Well, I guess I'm just wondering what happened in the past recent years that led basically everyone in DC to lose faith in the free hand of them. And I'm not trying to be all Adam Smith here. I'm just trying to, like, what happened that made everyone go, actually, we need to have a bit more market intervention to incentivize all these things?
Cheating. Cheating happened. The Chinese cheated at huge scale with government subsidies for their export products, with massive industrial espionage into our processes, formulae, manufacturing, all of it. And the fossil fuel industry globally cheated on its responsibilities to deal with its negative externalities of its pollution. And in the face of that cheating, we have had to try to address those concerns through the tools that we have.
Please.
So Sheldon and I would disagree on the fossil fuel aspect of this.
You did it. Disagreement at last, Alex.
That's why Politico's here, baby.
But I will not go down that cul-de-sac. But I will point out that one thing that has happened, I'm not an economist, I'm a gastroenterologist, but in Frederick Hayek's Road to Serfdom, he mentions how there should be a tax upon externality, and I think I recall, I read it many years ago, that he specifically speaks about air pollution.
Yeah.
So now this is the icon of conservative, and I think it should be of, in general, economics, and he talks about that. Now, I wouldn't say it's a failure of free market. I would say it is a failure of the free market to apply to address the externality being foisted upon the rest of us, and rather this is the true free market to charge them for that.
Yeah. Milton Friedman said it very clearly.
I don't know how to jump in between two senators. Can I jump in? Is that
Please,
okay?
Jump in.
Honestly, you never have to ask permission, just do it.
So it's really fascinating to listen to this conversation as a computer scientist who's been screaming about cybersecurity for like 20 years, because it was exactly the same thing.
Yep.
It was free to pollute, because consistently the market was incentivizing capability over security. Just now, President Biden's White House cybersecurity strategy formally put incentives in the national policy. I think there's a really interesting parallel here. And it was funny, I was recently at a climate security meeting, and I was thinking, wow, I feel more optimistic about cyber than climate, which has never happened to me before. But I think we're getting to that same place where we're understanding that the cost of the security flaws, which essentially is pollution and essentially everything that the senators have been talking about, has to be explicitly incentivized. It's just, the parallels are fascinating.
So
I think Lindsey Graham was John's favorite senator. He used to call him my idiot bastard son, so clearly he was a favorite. And Lindsay and I came very close to landing a bill that would have done just that, put those financial incentives in place to meet up. I think it's a very common problem, and when you have big industries that have an incentive to take advantage of it not working, you then have the political problem of trying to defeat that. But incentives solve problems.
Yeah.
So I know we're talking geopolitics and big think here, but we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the domestic angle to all of this here, right? And I want to read something. This is from Semaphore today. They did a nice little roundup on the case for climate optimism, but it starts with some pessimism. Let me quickly read it. Nearly 3/5 of Americans under 35 say climate change is a direct threat to them, and almost half say they worry a great deal about it. Global research shows even starker figures. A 2021 survey of 10,000 young people aged 16 to 25 found that 84% were at least somewhat worried. Around half said they felt, quote, sad, anxious, angry, powerless, helpless, and guilty, that it negatively affected their daily life. So that's on one end. On another end, I took a look at the US Energy and Employment Report from 2022, because that's the nerd I am. And while energy jobs are going up, there were 32,000 jobs lost in the petroleum sector since 2020, or 2021, 2020, excuse me.
That was in 2020.
That was in 2020, thank you. And then 7,000 lost in coal. And so I'm wondering, it feels like there's going to be a bit of a pull here. On one end, you're going to have younger folks, and we know how they tend to vote these days, pushing for more climate activism. And you're going to have another set of folks who are saying, you know, we make a lot of energy here in the United States, we can unleash, plus we could be a major partner of fossil fuels and all, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's going to lead to different political priorities. So I'm wondering, even though we have agreement on tariffs and you know, incentives, the American public is divided over sort of how seriously to take the issue.
I don't think anybody who thinks seriously about this is actually divided. I live in a state which has lost more land mass to rising sea levels than any other state in the nation. An area of land mass equal to Delaware, but a state which is probably per capita the most carbon intense in the United States. And so I live with that tension. How do we address that? Well, first, 2020 is an anomaly because that's during the pandemic, and of course, as we know, at some point, oil became below zero coming out of West Texas. So there was just a worldwide shutdown on fuel usage. But in my state, in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, we put dollars and programs towards helping to sequester the carbon that is produced by the refineries and all those plants that make the essential products for modernity. This is made from natural gas, this bottle. We could not have gotten here without the jet fuel produced in my state and along the Gulf Coast. So they're essential. But we put in a set of policies which are now going to sequester the carbon produced in a variety of ways, either utilize or sequester, and there's billions being invested for that. I say to the working families of my state, one, we're going to help you keep your job, but we're also going to make your product more competitive with a product from China because our carbon footprint is less. And by the way, we're going to create more jobs for that pipe fitter. Instead of making a pipe that's taking natural gas from here to there, you'll be taking carbon dioxide from here to there. And your core competency will still be in place. This is economic development for our working Americans, and whatever policy we come up with has got to have that as the focal point of everything we do.
And there's been very strong bipartisan support for these carbon capture efforts. If you are concerned about local jobs, the way Bill is, it's a win. If you're concerned about reducing emissions and the safety of our natural world, then it's also a big win, because essentially every study has us going beyond 1.5 degrees, unfortunately.
Right.
And that means we're going to have to claw our way back. So even if we went to zero new emissions, once you're over the red line, you've got to claw it back. You can't just go to zero. You've got to actually be able to extract it. And so building the infrastructure to reduce the output of existing plants and offset it, and also to be able to fund the extraction of excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere so that we get back into this zone of climate safety that has kept our species happy for, what, 40,000 plus years now. It's another strong area of bipartisanship.
But a quick sort of business question, right? Because if the ultimate goal here is to move to sort of net zero or green energy, it's all well and good to say, yeah, we'll still do fossil fuels and your core competency will stay and we'll do carbon capture. But at some point, sort of the interest in that market, the investments in that market probably start going away if that is where, especially in government incentives are saying we got to move away from that industry. I'm wondering how that industry sort of survives, because it seems like people are, of course, again, losing jobs, wondering, what about me down the line or my family down the line?
My take on that, I mean, there are a lot of economic studies about the so-called carbon bubble. And the question is how responsibly we move through that transition. Does it happen gradually? Or do you go along just paying no attention, being as stupid as you possibly can be, until events suddenly provoke a catastrophic change in behavior? Economies don't do well with sudden and catastrophic changes, and the effects that are expected from a bursting of the carbon bubble are extremely dramatic worldwide. I mean, really unpleasant for all human beings. So it's really important to try to have that transition happen as smoothly and predictably as possible. When Bill was talking about the planes that brought us here, one of the reasons we're all here is because those planes landed smoothly and predictably. If suddenly they had gone straight to the earth, we wouldn't be here now. And the difference between a safe landing and a violent landing is a very real one, and it's true in economics as well as in aircraft.
The International Energy Agency predicts increasing use of fossil fuels at least through 2050. Again, people just take for granted how much all these products that are made with fossil fuels as feedstock, the carpet that we're on, the synthetics in our clothes, you name it. So the idea that we're going to have a fossil fuel-free future, what an alliteration, just seems to me like, what are you smoking? Yeah. Now, Richard and I were talking last night, Freeport-McMoRan is seeing a very bullish on copper because we're going to electrify our economy. I get that. But there will be a continuity probably for gas to give backup. I would also point out that natural gas, as an example, is part of the solution. The United States has emissions, absolute emissions in the US are lower now than they were in the 2005, or maybe just about the same. I haven't seen this latest year's statistics. That's beside 30 million more people, a much larger economy, more oil and gas being produced domestically, and some reshoring of carbon-intense manufacturing. But we're lower than we were in 2005. Why? Because natural gas has replaced coal. If China bought more natural gas replacing their coal, we'd have a much different discussion regarding the impact of global climate change, but they haven't. So I would argue that which people are saying is part of the problem is also part of the solution, which is the complexity of the argument, which is why we need researchers figuring out how to go forward.
Well, speaking of, I want to ask, I mean, there's been a lot of agreement here, again, my failure, but Senator Whitehouse in an interview with a paper apparently called the New York Times, I don't know who they are, but you said, talking about climate solutions, that what helps effectively paper over differences is anything that is anti-China warms the cackles of Republican hearts, or cockles of Republican hearts. I'm not going to ask about your cockles, Senator, but I do want to ask Dr. Bliss about, I mean, is I guess this sort of go against China moment, is this what's papering over differences? Is this what's incentivizing all of this action? And can it survive if and when, let's say, this moment of bipartisan agreement of everyone, China's the big enemy here kind of goes away? This may not be for a while, by the way, but I'm just...
Sure. So I do first just want to go back to something Senator Whitehouse said earlier. I think people do have a hard time seeing the problem when it's not right in front of them. Like, for example, in Arizona, as Governor Hobbs has mentioned, we have pretty serious challenges with water, and as a result, there's a bipartisan agreement on water in the state. With regards to China, so if you think about China establishing foothold in states that have potential for failure or being vulnerable, or where there may be a higher risk of extreme events, and controlling whether it's cobalt mines or other kind of mines or other aspects of trade, I think absolutely that is a threat, right? Because essentially, again, it's that counterbalance between autocracy and theocracy. And at the moment, Senator Cassidy has mentioned it, China has very little regulation on a lot of these things. And as a result, they can move into places very fast, and they can, that foothold is not just, it's not just an energy foothold, it's an information foothold, it's a governance foothold. So, I do think it's a uniting entity there.
I'd add to what you said by pointing out that one of the reasons we're gathered here, I think, is because John, in addition to being, I think, America's best exemplar and ambassador of freedom, also believed passionately in what America means to the world. And we have a really strong record over the last American century of having been an incredibly powerful example to the world, and a force for good, whether it was the Marshall Plan or MacArthur's efforts to redevelop Asia, or our determination to defeat communism. And our brand is important to us. And I think if we don't solve the climate problem, and our democracy, American democracy, is seen to have flubbed this, and particularly if it's seen to have flubbed it because of special interest influence, the worst possible reason for a democracy to flub an issue, then that hits us right in our brand. And China and Russia and other countries who have other views of governance are not going to hesitate to use that example against us, particularly in these southern global countries where the climate effects are going to be felt far more immediately because people live still so much closer to a herding and agricultural and close to the land fishing means of life. And I think we're putting the American brand at very grave risk by not being responsible about solving this problem, and our adversaries are going to be eager to exploit that risk.
Maybe just to close on this, because I know we're between you and lunch, and so make sure, by the way, that while you're at lunch, you subscribe to National Security Daily Politico. I write it. It's pretty good.
I subscribe to it. It's nice.
Thank you. Honestly, that's going on the masthead. It's nice. To close here, as we're heading into a 2024 election, I think there's momentum, obviously from this discussion on these issues, but one could imagine it's going to slow down, as I can't imagine that there's going to be a lot of bipartisan agreement on climate as that election goes forward. So how do you keep this sort of simmering while that boils?
I wouldn't be so sure about that. Bill and I both represent coastal states. We're going to have to redraw our maps if we don't get this right. We both are looking at a same American electorate that is now keenly alert to the problems of climate change, and we're looking at an American electorate that wants to see bipartisan solutions. So I think that even in an election context, there's a strong, open avenue to get these things done.
I have a dim view of both the leading presidential candidates' leadership abilities. Let me just first say that. But when I didn't read Sheldon's
He's
New York
half right.
What's that? I thought you liked Biden. But I didn't read his editorial. But when he says national security in China, et cetera, warms the cockles of a Republican's heart. If you think about this, this is a nexus. It is a nexus of economic development, keeping jobs here for the American people, with a climate policy that Sheldon would be very enthused about, and a national security policy that apparently warms the cockles of a Republican's heart. Now, you can look at that, and each one of those is part and parcel. It isn't like, oh, I'm just buying these two because I have this one. No, if you don't buy all three, you don't get the other two. And so I think the robustness of this conversation is it has the ability to take a Lindsey Graham national security hawk and a Sheldon Whitehouse, climate change is a greater existential threat than China, and you put them on the same page with a Bill Cassidy whose focal point is how do I keep jobs here for American workers, but also acknowledging the other two. So I think that this policy, its time has come, and not even our presidential candidates, I think, can fumble that.
Well, with that, I want to thank Senator Whitehouse, Dr. Bliss, Senator Cassidy. I've been Alex Ward of Politico. Thank you very much.
And a big thank you to the McCain
And thank you to the
Institute.
McCain Institute.